for medicinal marijuana, and we're kind of moving in a good direction there, but what this will mean to that.
Right.
So there's a lot of impacts
Right.
on that, which we will hope to get into.
Absolutely.
But obviously, this region, if you extend north, is also known for our cultivation of cannabis.
Yep.
And so there's a lot of concerns about what this going to mean for them,
Yep.
too. So why don't we start with that and talk about the illegal growing market and what this is going to mean for them.
Yeah, so let me contextualize, because it's a good way to begin your questions and frame this. A couple of years back, formally in October of 2013, I decided to organize a work group of 24 folks, about roughly half supporting legalization, the other half questioning or vehemently opposing legalization. Head of the Police Chiefs Association, among others, as part of this Blue Ribbon Commission that we organized. And the reason I organized it was to answer some of the concerns you just expressed, to try to understand the issue in a much more nuanced way myself, to take some account of my own responsibility as being a lieutenant governor of a state that likely would have seen a legalization initiative on the ballot with or without my support or consent or even opposition, to try to reconcile the fact that as a father of 4 kids, I don't want to see the drug used and abused by my children. I don't want to walk down the streets or sidewalks to smell it. I don't want to go to parks and playgrounds and see it. I don't want big tobacco to become big marijuana. I'm concerned about driving under the influence. I love our diverse communities, and I want to see them preserved and protected and not turned over to cannabis distributors on every street corner and every community up and down the state. And so we went out and spent about a year and a half, benefited not only by a diverse coalition, but benefited by the examples of Washington State, by Colorado, by the more contemporary examples of the legalization efforts and initiatives in Oregon and Alaska. We actually incorporated in the task force and the work group the voices of those that were responsible for the implementation in Colorado, the authors of the legislation in Washington State, so we had the benefit of their examples. We did a series of town hall meetings beginning in Los Angeles and Oakland, California, focusing on children, youth, and family, Fresno on public safety, and we went to the Emerald Triangle. We went up to Humboldt, talked to folks from Trinity and Mendocino counties about their unique concerns, their unique perspectives. I made a fateful mistake of beginning the town hall up in Humboldt by saying I was there to talk about the legalization of marijuana. Was immediately reminded that the word marijuana is a pejorative, it's cannabis, and was reminded of the nuances of this debate, that it's a complicated issue, and legalization is a complicated consideration as it relates to the voters and their judgment in November. I got involved in this candidly because, frankly, there was an absence of leadership on it. And I'm someone, Steve knows this, that tends to lean into issues. I think we're desperate for leadership, whether you support my point of view or you're opposed to it. I certainly respect that. We have a debate even at my own household on this issue. But I hope you appreciate that I was taking some account, trying to be responsible, tried to lend an opinion, tried to organize some thoughtfulness around this initiative. And I did that because I was very concerned about some of the initiatives that I was reading about that were being drafted, some of those that were promoting legalization that I didn't think necessarily had the best interests of our children, youth, and family or public safety in mind. And that bore out. 19 initiatives were bandied about. Literally 19. Coincidentally, 19. This last initiative was Prop 19. We're out there getting some form of title and summary. We're being forwarded to the Attorney General's office for consideration. And frankly, none of them had particularly been vetted. There wasn't the comprehensive outreach. There wasn't a comprehensive coalition that was formed in any of those initiatives. And so when we came out with our recommendations, it turned out to be reasonably prescient, meaning the purpose of the recommendations was to aid in a more thoughtful and I think mature conversation about what legalization would look like in California. We came out with 50 specific recommendations. We began our work by saying the following: we don't believe this should be California's next gold rush, that this is not about generating revenue for revenue's sake. That idea that somehow this is going to plug your budget deficits is laughable on the substance and merits because of the size and scope of California's budget, but also that's not what we should be doing with a drug that is of concern, particularly for our children and youth, and as it relates to public safety. We shouldn't be promoting it as a government entity per se, particularly for revenue generation. But we also said that if we do move forward with legalization, it's not an act that will occur on election day. It's a process that will unfold over the course of many, many years, and that whatever we do, we cannot be ideological about it. We've got to be open to argument, interested in evidence. Those with vehement points of view of opposition have merit. Those that are concerned about driving under the influence of marijuana legitimately should be concerned about what's going on in their streets and sidewalks today. People that are concerned about the appetites of free enterprise and big money should be concerned about reining those things in, and those voices should be at the table as it relates to any regulatory structure. An individual that I've known for years and others came to me and said, we like the recommendations. Would you be considerate of joining us in an effort to incorporate some of your recommendations into yet another initiative? But hopefully this initiative would be one that we can build consensus around and work with some of these other groups so that we don't have competing initiatives. And ultimately that's the initiative, 62-page long initiative that's in front of you for discussion today. We think we give great justice to these concerns and consideration. There's simply never been an initiative for the recreational use and legalization for adults ever placed in front of the voters in any state. We think that has been more regulated than this initiative is proposing, more comprehensive than this initiative, and no initiative that we think is more flexible as well, that allows the policymakers in real time to adjust and amend based upon changing realities, unintended and intended consequences into the future. And we can go into some of the merits of it, the details, but yeah, that's the framework of the engagement.
Yeah, so how do you respond to those who say, you know, you had all the best intentions with your Blue Ribbon Committee, but what actually came out in the end is a little more, well, I think the Sacramento Bee said it was more commercially focused than socially focused.
Vehemently, I just disagree on the merits. And as an expert in what we put out, I'm not convinced that there was real analysis done in terms of their perspective. Their analysis sort of begs the question of when you compare and contrast the recommendations and compare what's in the initiative, pretty close.
Yeah.
So, I mean, our point has been, and simply, and I should probably say, you know, the initiative was drafted over an 18-month period involving the input of hundreds of organizations and experts, thousands of individuals.
Yeah, well
it was
beyond
a long
the
process.
Yeah.
Then the Blue Ribbon Commission happened, adopted a significant number of those recommendations to the extent possible, but the biggest intervening event, you referred to it earlier, was the passage of MRSA, which created a regulatory structure, which then Prop 64 was modeled after. I mean, Prop 64 is essentially adding adult use marijuana to the regulatory structure what the legislature and governor already created. And the people and those who have concerns about the commercial market, creating a commercial marketplace, you know, it's not Prop 64 that's creating a commercial marketplace for marijuana. That commercial marketplace has been in existence since 1996. It's now newly regulated by the legislature and the governor, and we're simply adding adult use to it. The two fundamental big differences in Prop 64 compared to MRSA is we decriminalize it. You know, we needed to do that, and most Californians agree that that is something that needs to be done. We continue to arrest thousands of people selectively in certain communities across the country, disproportionately communities of color. We continue to issue criminal misdemeanors to thousands of juveniles, ruining their lives, no financial aid, no job prospects, all for a drug that the President of the United States says is less addictive and less harmful than alcohol. So we decriminalize, and then we do something that the legislature wasn't able to do, but they wanted to do, which was create a tax structure. Which, because as we all know in the legislature, you can't get, and I don't mean to be partisan, you can't, it's hard to get 2/3 votes for a tax, especially for marijuana in this legislature. And so, you know, there are various electeds, including both your senator and assemblyman from this district, that attempted to create a tax structure. And so we're doing that with Prop 64. And so there is a excise tax that goes on top of that. But to the issues of how does it reconcile with local government wants and wishes? We worked very closely with League of Cities, Association of Counties, rural counties, urban counties. This is the first statewide marijuana measure in the history of the state that those four organizations haven't opposed. They're neutral on all counts. We work very closely with them. They have complete local control on all time, manner, and use permits within their district.
Let's get into that.
Yeah, go ahead.
As I said, Santa Rosa and the county are both rolling out their own permitting process, their own regulations. There's uncertainty about that. Is this going to wipe that out, or how is that going to work together? What is the message to the
So what
local?
Jason just said is incredibly important. There was a big gap. There was a lot of empty pages in this initiative, waiting to see what the governor was going to do, working with the legislature collaboratively to get the medical regulations in place. We basically took all of that and layered it in. We're building on top of that. None of that's negated. We provide absolute local control. If Santa Rosa decides tomorrow, we're not interested in any of this. We don't want to see any of these dispensaries in any street corner. You have absolute control, absolute right to reject it. Any community in the state of California can just say no. All of that is afforded. All of that was built upon the existing regulatory structure. And let's be candid here. I don't want to overstate, but the likelihood that there would have been any medical regulatory framework had it not been for our initiative is pretty suspect. Maybe it's taken them 20 years.
The year before, the pro tem introduced a bill and couldn't get passed. That was the pro tem of the Senate.
So the fact that we did what we did,
So you're saying it was a preemptive strike?
it was a way of everybody. I think there was a recognition this was going to happen. It put kind of pressure for compromise that was necessary, created the conditions that allowed for this process to go forward.
And they got what they wanted because we built 64 around. We decided we're not going to reinvent a wheel that the legislature and Governor Brown have created, so we created 64 on their model. We don't change anything significantly. In fact, we preserve. You wrote a column, Paul, a while ago that said we're going to be throwing out. Everybody said that. Don't worry, you're not alone. But the truth is, everything that was passed in MRSA, every one of those things is preserved in Prop 64, with no exceptions, with the exception of the tax code. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
Law enforcement raises the provision about unreasonable regulation,
Right.
As really a way around local prohibitions or almost any restriction is going to be easily challengeable or at least protracted challenges based on the reasonableness.
We've heard that in the long laundry list of scare tactics. And listen, there is language in there that was lifted from Washington and Colorado. It's never been invoked in either of those states. The issue is in the situations where local jurisdictions are banning by making things as difficult as possible without effectively banning. There is a remedy in those situations. It's never been triggered because the threshold is so high in any state. We don't expect it to be done here. Those are extreme circumstances. I mean, again, and by the way, I would make the point that the Association of Counties, the League of Cities, the Association of Rural Counties, the Association of Urban Counties all reviewed that language and signed off on it. And they're the ones who had the most to potentially be superseded by if those things were ever invoked.
And irony of that personally is not lost on me, since it was law enforcement themselves that encouraged those local provisions, and now they're used as points of critique, which I find rich.
Well, let's talk about the taxing aspects.
Right.
You brought that up because it does relate to some of the concern that exists in our rural growers, and the whole goal here is to get them out from the dark and come into the light. And yet some are. I think we had a quote from one of the people who came to one of the county's forum. They said prohibition is clearly over, but there's still a lot of rules. I want to be compliant, but I have a family to support. Their concern is that with all these rules and with all these taxes, it still may be more affordable to stay in the dark and be in the underground. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, well, we all have to operate with some. I mean, I'm a business person. I don't get to play by my own rules. So I say with respect. We try to incorporate their voice, their concern, their culture in the spirit of this initiative. But there's rules of the road. You got to comply with them. You have to respect local planning, local zoning. You got to respect state laws. You've got to respect the environment. You've got to participate in the taxation that is associated with any business activity in the state. And I know those things are difficult for some folks. The vast majority, I think, are willing, ready, willing, and able to participate. But the expectation is, and we've seen this in other states, the price of cannabis will drop in a legalized market. That the taxes will create at least some floor, that the black market will persist for a period of time. Anyone who suggests otherwise is wildly overstating that. It will persist, I think, with a little more modest degree than in Colorado. I think they taxed, with respect, too high. They also did not tax medical, which means everyone seems to be remarkably sick there. At least not everybody, but a higher percentage than I imagine would otherwise be ailed, whatever the phrase is. I'm now making words up. Nonetheless, those are legitimate concerns. It's a new day.
What about the possibility of taxes getting too high? I mean, we've got every city and county wants to layer on. They want to pot for potholes.
And that's why we don't want pot for potholes. That's why I began the conversation. We began our report saying this is not about California's next gold rush. If this is about local government plugging their gaps, we think that's a mistake. And by the way, personally, I will happily engage and participate in that public discourse of opposition if that's the intent. If this is about generating money to solve all your problems, count me out. To the extent there is taxation, that money we believe should go in certain categories, certain areas that are traditionally underfunded, particularly drug and alcohol treatment programs, mental health, behavioral health programs, preschool, after-school programs, focusing on children and youth, public safety. Despite the opposition of a lot of public safety, we provide 20% of the resources back to public safety grants and 20% back to the environment, which we think is an incredibly important part of this larger discussion that's often forgotten. And that's the water diversion issues, the issues that you experience and see disproportionately here in the North Coast of California, that frankly have, I think, they have profound consequences in terms of quality of life, and will be addressed substantially by this initiative.
I want to make a distinction between the concerns about regulations, living in a regulated market, versus the tax. The rules and regulations, most of those that come in Prop 64 are picked up from the MRSA legislation that's already passed. They're already, if you're going to live in a regulated market under medical, you're already living under those regulations. Right. Those haven't been promulgated yet. The benefit and the reason that we're doing this now is so that they can be promulgated together. But this was to benefit those who want to live in a legal, regulated, safe market and not continue to operate in the shadows. Those who want to continue to do that, that's a hard thing to, at this point, the vast majority of business leaders that I've met and the vast majority of the public wants a legal, regulated market.
And I will say it will get harder. I mean, the intent of this is, if you don't come out of those shadows, the reason we're providing up to $200 million a year in law enforcement grants is to go after the bad actors. But focus there, not on the street corners of America, at least in this state, and not do buy bus programs and throw black and brown kids up against the wall disproportionately and say, what's in your pocket? What's going on? That it's a focus on the cartels, focus on the illegal activity, and there'll be real resources to do it. So again, I don't want to minimize the concern of those that want to continue to play on the margins. There's pause for concern.
I want you to understand why we came up with the tax structure, which is we brought in a team of economists, which included 2 former finance directors for the state of California, and evaluated. What we wanted to do is we wanted to create a unitary tax structure so that we didn't have this binary where everybody who lives here is just diverting into medical improperly because they're getting a huge tax break. But we didn't want to price legitimate patients out of the marketplace. So we tried to get an evaluated forecast of, in a legal regulated market, the price of marijuana is going to go down, right? Right now, medical patients are paying 7% state sales tax. If you have a valid recommendation from a physician, you're going to be exempt from the state sales tax. So you're saving that 7% tax. The rest is essentially what economists predict is going to be the savings that comes from the price decrease in a regulated market. So we think patients are going to be protected. Yeah, go ahead.
At some point, don't we need to reconcile medicine, intoxicant? If my doctor prescribes something for me, I don't pay taxes on it. My doctor recommends marijuana, I do.
The answer is yes, we want to do that. Unfortunately, under federal law, we can't completely do that because doctors can't prescribe under federal law something that continues to be against
And do
federal law.
we have a next step? We're gonna be looking at 5 years down the line here, if we have a fuzzy line between medicine and recreational chemicals that, well, all right, you take opioids for a bad back, me, I like to get smashed. And if we can do that with marijuana, why not with,
I don't see. You're the first person to bring that up, and there's no conversations ongoing in any camp that I've heard around that line. So the answer is no. In the next 5 years, I think that chance is extraordinarily unlikely. I think cannabis. Look, we've had de facto legalization since 1996. You've got 23 states that have de facto legalization. You have 4 that have already legalized. It's likely to have multiple states this year. The idea this is a Schedule I drug, I think even the most extreme critics of ours would acknowledge is rather perverse and absurd to suggest that somehow cannabis should stand side by side with LSD and heroin. And if people believe that, then chances are we're not going to have a very good conversation, because then we're living in potentially 2 different parallel universes. And a lot of people do believe that in the federal government. That said, the medical system, I think there's another issue that's related to your concern that is a legitimate concern. I imagine in 5 years, the 2 systems will be challenged to stand side by side. You saw in Washington State, they actually did collapse in a unitary system because of related concerns. I think that's a prospect here. The reality is, we didn't lean into that because we were just trying to finally reconcile the fact we hadn't regulated medical. We were respecting that process. We didn't want to completely usurp it and challenge it and withdraw any of that good work that was done. But I think there will be some ongoing issues and friction. But I don't think it's a slippery slope concern. I think there are other logistical concerns.
I would point out the California Medical Association has endorsed this, the California Academy of Preventive Medicine, and their argument, and they've been on the forefront of this issue, their argument has been, is medical merit, the vast majority of licensed physicians and medical experts agree that there are some medical benefits. We don't know, the research has been suppressed. We need more clinical trials, need more peer-reviewed research, but but the only way we're ever going to get to that point is if we have a medical system that is made for patients, where we can actually have a discussion about what does a medical grade cannabis product look like, what's the best way for people to take it and ingest it, what are the symptoms, treat it and regulate it like medicine. You're right, it's hard to do that in the current system when so many people are essentially non-symptomatic, non-patients, but they're diverted into a medical system, and yet they still have to go to a physician to get a recommendation. And so that's why they support this, because they view an adult use system for non-patients strengthens the medical system.
Go ahead.
Well, you mentioned bad actors, you mentioned cartels, this whole out of the shadows move. What do you think will be the effect on the Emerald Triangle, the economies there, and the way cannabis is cultivated? Where will that change? Where it will be cultivated in the state now?
We went to great lengths to try to preserve and protect that culture, and that's why I used the language of culture. We are creating appellations, or at least the opportunity for appellations to be developed. We are prioritizing small growers and small businesses for the first 5 years. Actually drafted that in specifically, prescriptively, trying to protect and preserve the opportunity for small and local. And we have a lot of language, and Jason could fill in a lot of the language that reinforces that meme. It's a big part of at least my desire as it relates to move towards legalization, is to protect and preserve that, and not see the cannibalization of that, not see the monopolization of that, and not see some of these larger multinational folks coming in and destroying that, which is a very legitimate concern that we're going to have to be aggressively monitoring to protect and preserve those unique cultural characteristics, particularly in the North Coast. But that said, we don't know what we don't know, and that's why we drafted this with the kind of flexibility to address the unknowns in real time. And I think this is such an important point. And no one knows. Anyone who suggests they know what everything's going to happen is making that up. Colorado quickly realized they were wrong on edibles. They were not protecting their children. They didn't have appropriate packaging. They didn't have appropriate labeling. They were doing gummy bears that were infused that we're targeting children and youth. They fix that. There's many things that they reconcile. We don't, we by the way, do not make those mistakes. That's one mistake we won't make because we're going to address those issues up front. But there will be issues. And those issues now have the capacity to be dealt with a simple majority by the legislature.
How do you respond to the mom and pop operations that are really concerned about how this is written? It really tips the scales in favor of big tobacco, big cannabis coming in and really dominating the industry and making it more difficult for them to operate.
Yeah, let's
Well, I
reinforce
say,
some of the points.
well, look,
you brought
I
up.
say with due respect, and every time I sit down with a grower, and we're getting more and more grower support every day, we're about to roll out some endorsements from some of the grower groups. But the, is don't believe what you're hearing in the rumor mill. Actually sit down and read the measure or read the summary and see what we did here to protect this. He mentioned there's a 5-year limit on large cultivation licenses, but state regulators, based on anti-monopoly provisions, and we have the strictest anti-monopoly provisions of every marijuana policy measure in the country, based on anti-monopoly concerns as well as supply demand imbalances, can choose not to issue large cultivation licenses. They can't issue them in the first 5 years. After 5 years, they can, but they don't have to. The licenses, in terms of how they get issued, and remember, you can't operate after 2018 unless you have a license. The licenses are being issued in order of preference, starting with existing small operators that are operating legally according to their local regulations or under the new state system get preferences on their licenses. We also have a micro business license for the first, so they can actually, it's like a craft brewery. They can operate, they have a tasting room, they can have that, and that's something that the Emerald Triangle growers had asked for. He talked about the appellation, which is tied to the tracking and tracing system, which is very not dissimilar to Napa Valley as an appellation, or what the Italian and Spanish wine systems, where the label that allows you to track and trace every product has a Emerald Triangle appellation label attached to it. There's a sliding scale on fees. So the smaller a grower you are, the less you have to pay on the fees to get a license in the first place. And then we have worker protections. We have environmental protections. We fund, the measure pays for itself, including on compliance. So if you're a small grower and you have concerns about compliance, we have a 24-hour hotline. We have all these operators where you can actually sit down and learn how to properly comply so you're not overly burdened by the paperwork that's attached to it. And these are all things we did in a 6-month process with all the small growers.
Are some of these things you've learned from the mistakes of states like Colorado and
yeah.
Washington?
And by the way, we didn't get it right perfect the first time. I mean, one of the benefits is 2 years ago, the legislature passed a law that allowed you to amend your measure. You could put it out for 35 days and get people's input. And we knew, we'd met with hundreds of groups, but we knew, we hadn't talked to everybody yet. So we put out a measure to get a reaction. And if you look at the difference between the amended version and the version that we introduced first, most of the amendments, there was some child protections we put in, we put a lot of local government measures, but most of the amendments were small grower protections from folks who are owning, they want to do things the right way, they're worried about the consequences and the burdens of all that. And that's how we ended up making all the amendments we did, like the 5-year limit on licenses.
That said, this is not like Colorado, not like Oregon, Alaska, Washington. This is California. This is a game changer. Those states are interesting small ball warm-up. I mean, this is a big question of being asked. In one respect. In another respect, there's a separate argument. This is not even interesting because we've de facto had legalization. Nothing's going to change, some suggest. I mean, sincerely. People are driving under the influence of drugs right now. It's still illegal for kids right now to use. You've got a lot of cities, like San Francisco, when I was mayor, we had very regulated medical market, very restrictive. And there are many other cities that have very regulated medical market. Not every city does. It's not standardized. Some people just don't think it's going to radically change. You could see some arguments to that extent even coming out of Colorado. The governor himself, who was opposed, now saying, it hasn't really changed. More people more people supportive now of legalization in Colorado and after. Kids were asked where they saw a decline in use in Colorado when they surveyed 17,000 kids. They said, nothing's changed. They said, why am I more or less likely when I could get it anyway? Before legalization, it's still illegal for me. You've seen an actual decrease.
But the opponents in Colorado, who paper us daily,
say
the opposite. And
but they can't say that. But because this is a point of personal privileges. I want to be factual around these things, and there's a lot of assertions The opponents cannot say, because they have zero evidence, that teenage use has gone up since legalization. They cannot say that.
They
I guess
do say it. They say
But
it.
they're wrong.
But they're
Oh,
wrong
every
because,
study.
because they, well, I guess anyone could say anything,
I mean-
but they can't. There's no basis to which they
And
can
we-
back up what they're
And
saying.
we try to be careful because we know it's a small sample size. It's 4 years. It's hard to tell, But the credible, objective groups that have done surveys, both polling as well as numerical medical surveys of teen use in those states, have shown either constant or gone down. Now, it's incremental. I don't want to overstate this, right? I mean, we believe this is a safer, that a decriminalized, a system that focuses not on criminalization, incarceration, but on treatment and control is a better system and keeps kids safer.
Well, one thing I know
But-
is drug dealers don't card your kids. They sure as hell don't care about what they're selling your kids. There's no seed to sale tracking. There's no transparency in packaging. They don't give a damn. That's the world that exists today. But beyond the argument of whether or not it is significant or insignificant, I'm of the opinion it is significant. I was arguing some people believe this. I think the fact is this is a game changer because, just put it in perspective, Colorado last year, retail and recreational medical sales were less than $1 billion a year. Emerald Triangle, we estimate anywhere from, depends who you talk to, $9 to $13 billion a year of cannabis produced just in those 3 counties. This is a game changer. It's going to impact, you mentioned the cartels, not just in the state, but south of the border. I was talking to George Shultz, Secretary Shultz says this is a major foreign policy question that will have profound impact on our relationships, not just in Mexico, but Latin America writ large. There's some evidence, some will overstate it, I don't want to overstate it, but some evidence that the cartels have already been impacted by Washington and Colorado. Certainly, the number of murders in Mexico has significantly declined from the high of 23,000 in 2011 to less than 16,000 last year. The amount of cannabis that sees at the border has substantially declined since legalization. Now, that could be coincidental. There are many factors that play into that, including different strategies of engagement with our new president in Mexico. But this, I believe, will be a game changer in terms of cartel activity in and out of the state, and will impact the national debate on cannabis. This is not just about California. I'm into this because it's social justice. To me, this is about black and brown folks. This is about poor folks being targeted. And to suggest they haven't been is not to actually pay attention to some of the inconvenient truths. Last year, 8,866 felonies,
Nonviolent
nonviolent marijuana felonies in the state last year. 80,056 since 2010 felonies. We're still arresting folks. We're still incarcerating folks, but they don't look like me. And we're still wasting huge amount of resources. Police overtime on our buy and bust programs, prosecution, defense. You got folks that are difficult time in and out of the criminal justice system. And if you're a fiscal conservative, you must, I don't know how folks can sleep at night, the war on drugs. It's the manifestation of waste. It's the manifestation of inefficiency. It's a manifestation of unburdened bureaucracy and just coral reefs of layers of more and more waste and ineffectiveness. The outcome is today more kids, our kids, are saying it's easier than ever to get marijuana. And that sort of begs the question, if we reject 64, what's the alternative? Because the status quo is not particularly a good one when it comes to taxpayer dollars, when it comes to the use of this drug, people driving under the influence, when it comes to folks out in the street corners at the local movie theater selling to your kids. And I haven't heard one thing, literally not one thing, from any of our opponents, except doubling down on the current strategies that they're offering as an alternative to the status quo. And that concerns me candidly more than some of their concerns around that they've brought up around 64.
But
Go ahead.
where you began is, I'm a father of 4, and most of the criticism or the questions I hear around this are not necessarily factual questions or regulatory questions. They're this notion of a more pervasive acceptance I'm not saying it's a factual argument. I'm saying, but I don't want to smell it on the playgrounds. I don't want my kids to use it.
The message you're being sent to kids.
Yeah.
But that is the question that comes up.
Look what we've done with tobacco. It's legal. I don't think anyone wants to make
Or
it illegal.
alcohol, by the way.
Look what we've done with alcohol.
30% for the
I mean,
lowest rates in 30 years for teen usage.
Yeah, and the poor bloke at the bar right here. Do we want to go call the cops? Say that guy needs to be thrown in jail because he's lining up Jack Daniels as we speak? I mean, it sounds preposterous, but that's what we're doing as it relates to cannabis. Look, I think we're not having any honest conversations with our kids because we're not allowed to have it. We're in a space because of the absurdity of this sort of fraudulent sort of notion that somehow, it doesn't exist. We can't talk about it. The kids are smart. They're shrewd. I'm not pro-cannabis. I'm anti-marijuana. By the way, it's my my position is I'm anti-marijuana. I'm also vehemently anti-prohibition. You do not have to be pro-marijuana to be pro-legalization. Quite the contrary. And the difference is we're going to have hundreds of millions of dollars to message that point of view. And there's no resources to message that point of view today, and to have a different conversation. So teenage use has not skyrocketed since 1996 in California. Driving under the influence has not skyrocketed. It's actually gone down in the state of California since 1996. You've de facto legalized it. I mean, this idea that it hasn't been normalized, I don't know, maybe I'm living in a different world. But it sure as hell seems normalized where I live.
No, I think that's a good point. I think the question then comes down to we've already decriminalized. We've already got a legislative solution.
But I understand.
Well, there's nobody in prison right now for possession.
There's nobody in state prison. There are
Okay.
people in jail.
County
There were
jails.
3 released
Every
yesterday in LA.
But we've already got a legislative remedy.
No, they have intent to sell, but they weren't selling. They had twice the limit amount, so they get charged with intent to sell. So they had more than 1 ounce. Sorry to interrupt.
But no, I mean, but given that we've already got a legislative remedy on the books, MRSA for medical cannabis, should we wait to let that take effect before we jump in with 64? And is there possibly a legislative solution to legalization? Why not?
My answer to that is absolutely not. I mean, look at the courage
Is that
of the
just-
elected officials, with all due respect. I mean, let's just be candid there, and with all our friends on Facebook Live. Apologies. But anyway, sorry, just as it relates to, why don't you answer, because we were asked this
The
question.
spokesperson for Senate Democrats. I mean,
Yeah,
they're
no,
very
right,
courageous,
that's
but I
ironic,
don't
yeah.
know what you're talking about. No, I mean, yeah, I mean, look, the pendulum, the arc of history is all bending in this direction, and everybody knows it. I mean, some people take a more of a leadership role than others. But
Well, why
in terms
not
of,
wait?
but in terms
That's
of
the
the
question
waiting,
we get a lot.
no, and
Yeah.
that's a very good question. The reason is because why continue to build on a medical system, to go to the question that was asked earlier, is are we going to do it the right way, or are we going to do it the convenient way? Right? We have a thriving medical system, but not everyone in the medical system. I mean, there's a reason why it's hard to regulate that product like medicine, is because not everybody in that system is a non-symptomatic patient. We're involving our physicians in this process. There's a reason the California Medical Association supports Prop 64. They don't want to be part of the gateway between a recreational adult user and an otherwise criminal an activity that society views is that the law books say is criminal. And so the best way to do this, and the Brown administration has, to their credit, is preparing to do this, is to promulgate these regulations together. Do it together. It's the same system. We're just adding adult use to the system that already exists. And more importantly, by creating a tax structure, we're actually paying for the enforcement of this measure for the first time. Right now, I mean, go to the Bureau of, which is in Natomas outside of Sacramento, if you go to the Bureau of Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety, the newly created bureau, they're understaffed and under-resourced, and there's a reason. They didn't have a line item emergency funding for the activity that they're doing. This measure pays for itself and the regulation of the medical system. It finally offsets. I mean, we all want to treat the medical, our already billion-dollar marijuana industry like a legitimate industry, right? We want our workers to be protected. We want transportation to be safe. We want all the burdens to be offset. Well, the only way you do that is you got to tax it and regulate it like any other industry.
Yeah.
And so that's the only way to do this.
But
right
let's
now,
get
we
back.
can't do that.
Let's
Yeah.
get back to the issue we talked about, the federal problems,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
It's still a Category 1 drug, and you still have all these operations dealing on a purely cash basis.
Yeah.
That will
Because of
change.
that.
That will change.
How do we change
It
that?
just the scope of our decision. California, you can't ignore California. You may ignore, I say respectfully, some of these other states. You're not going to ignore California. I mean, we're getting a point of absurdity now. The majority, half the states with medical marijuana and no banking relationships. I mean, at a certain point, federal government is going to wake up. I mean, the legislature, or at least, I mean, the Congress is waking up to this. They're going to have to. They have to deal with the medical. California moves towards recreational. These other states, they're going to have to deal with it. I think this thing tips pretty quickly. And you also have two presidential nominees that have both said, they've on record saying they're going to allow states to continue to operate if they move towards legalized regulatory market with kind of, sort of 10th Amendment autonomy afforded by our founders.
It's the one thing Hillary
They
and Donald
agree.
Trump agree on.
Yeah.
But there is he's right, there is a growing bipartisan federal consensus about change. Jared Huffman, a local congressman here, is involved in that discussion. It's bipartisan. We had a Republican congressman standing at our kickoff press conference. And, look, I think everybody was kind of stunned by the DEA announcement doubling down on their position. But
Right.
this is the domino that when with 60, I mean, you ask, how do we change federal law? The first step is Prop 64, because when the biggest state changes its structure and the entire West is essentially at that point
Contiguous.
decriminalized and working together and coordinating, which they will, it will be it's going to be a game changer.
And may I extend just on everything he said in the previous question? Another reason why I want to move towards legalization, I want to change the trajectory in the war on drugs, not just in the state, this country. I want to actually radically change people's lives. That's why in politics in the first place. California moves towards legalization, it's going to radically change the debate in states that have none of the sensitivities we do, that have not, quote unquote, decriminalized, that never did what Governor Schwarzenegger had the courage to do in 2010.
But
I
then,
think
getting
that's-
back to my question a little bit ago, are we not 5 years from now talking about other narcotics? And it's a very libertarian position, and I know there's some public support
I'm
for it.
not-
Is that where you think we ought to be heading,
Well,
is to
I'm
take
not-
narcotics out of?
Well, I think you should.
Criminal justice system.
I think having a discussion and debate around medicalizing people's addictions is a healthy one, and I believe in harm reduction. Do I believe in legalizing cocaine and heroin? No, I do not. That's my personal opinion. Others have different points of view, and the example, for instance, the example in Portugal, which is a fascinating and interesting example. I'm not there. That's not my advocacy. I think cannabis is very distinctive, very unique in that respect.
Let me ask a practical implementation question.
Yep.
Similar to what I assume you have in your own businesses, we have a zero tolerance policy for
I'm a drug dealer,
drugs,
as you know. Yes.
and drugs and alcohol
Alcohol.
in the workplace.
Yes.
But when it comes to, ultimately, that turns on a test for alcohol. If someone's running a press or driving a truck or a forklift, what do you say to business folks about maintaining a drug-free workplace?
We worked with the Chamber of Commerce on the language. It is in stark contrast to Prop 19 that did not have that language that protects your right as an employer to fire someone for being impaired.
But that doesn't protect their right, the ability to win in court when they get sued for unlawful termination, because there isn't really a
It's
standard.
a definition of impaired being in your system. I don't know. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, there's not. So that goes to a deeper question, even broader question in the workplace, and is there a per se standard which does not exist for
Right.
cannabis because of the unique characteristics of cannabis versus alcohol.
Yeah.
So it is a more complicated question, but we did, for what it's worth, the language in that section was sanctioned by the California Chamber of Commerce, hardly a neutral force in terms of advocating for language. They were quite pleased, my understanding,
Yes.
you finally got the agreement with that language, giving and affording that right.
Right, to give them protection.
Right,
Yeah.
right. They're neutral on the measure, and this was not just an issue with employers. This was an issue with some other folks in the labor community too, because it's just the liability for public employees in this situation. How you enforce, as you say, and they want to be able to set very clear standards on drug-free workplaces. It's a big issue, but it's an issue And by the way, we got a lot of pushback, as you can imagine, from some of our social justice partners who believe that that's unfair. If you're supposed to be, if you smoked a joint on Friday, why shouldn't you be able to go to work on Monday if it's not impairing
Still
your
in your
behavior?
system, right, yeah.
And it's still in your system, but that was a trade-off, and it's something that we had to deal with, that we have to deal with today under medical. I mean, we have the same issues that are coming up under the medical system.
Well, just what is the message you have for law enforcement? Obviously, they're not happy with this, mainly because there isn't a standard for DUI.
Well, they're not happy because we're decriminalizing.
Well,
let's be clear.
okay,
But they
but
say
that's
it's
one of
not
the reasons.
DUI.
But we-
Yeah.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
but they should
Yeah.
be very happy we set aside tens of millions of dollars for research and development. They should be very happy we work with the California Highway Patrol to literally set aside millions of dollars on an annual basis specifically to deal with sobriety and roadside testing considerations and concerns so we can develop some more objective modalities. None of those things, by the way, will exist if we reject this, and the problem will persist, but without the resources associated. They must be pleased with the 20% of all of the resources associated with the tax revenue going back towards law enforcement and block grants for retraining and refocusing and reprioritizing their interdiction as relates to drug use and abuse and related enforcement issues that will come up because of legalization. So that would be my counter argument. And I hope they're respectful of the fact that despite their opposition, we incorporated a lot of their considerations of concern and tried to create a framework to address them, which, by the way, there was plenty of folks in our coalition that had no interest in that. But that wouldn't have been the right thing to do because their concerns, many of them were valid.
It's important to note that there is no statistical objective study that shows a connection between vehicular crash risk and legalized states, right? Despite the, they will cite studies that are based on 1 year and some THC analysis. There's no connection between, they can't prove impairment. These studies are statistically invalid, and they're usually done and paid for by groups that have an advocacy interest in what's going on. Plus, we've had a thriving medical marijuana system since 1996, and highway safety in the state of California has gone up. The safety has gone up.
It's remarkable,
accidents have gone
but
down
it's a
every year
significant
since
statistical
1996.
drop since 96
But
of DUIs.
I think we can agree that there probably are people that are driving under the impairment of marijuana somewhere in California, and the opponents are right about this one thing. Guy and I have talked about this a lot. There is no statewide standard, and there should be. And the groups that continue to throw it up as a reason for voting against Prop 64 have done very little to try to establish one. So we sat down 18 months ago with the CHP and worked through a technical process to evaluate, to create a statewide standard and protocols, give them the resources, evaluate on best practices, try to figure out what should be per se or permissive or presumptive standard on THC content in the blood. But most importantly, and this is what the AAA study on highway safety recommends, is to give local law enforcement the training and technology to actually be able to better detect, identify, and field test impaired drivers. And that's the big problem here, is that we don't really have a standard technology for evaluating cognitive problem, dexterity problems, or the THC evaluations. And under this measure, we're going to be giving hundreds of millions of dollars for that. Our roads will be safer at the end of
Well,
this.
that's you mentioned the THC evaluation. I mean, that's obviously the other issue. I think there are studies that emergency room visits have gone up in Colorado because of dosage issues on edibles.
Well, they didn't set clear warning labels on what dosages are, recommended
Serving
dosages,
sizes,
serving
et cetera.
sizes. There's no potency limits in Colorado. There will be under Prop 64. So, I mean, again,
By the
this
way,
is
that was
lessons
81
learned.
folks. I mean, let's just put it in. I mean, also put the scope and scale in perspective statistically, but the overall numbers can be used.
Well, I just don't know if I have to be careful eating the brownies at work. From
You
now
should
on.
always be careful about eating brownies today.
So you
Problem
mentioned
today.
Yeah.
social justice partners. You
Yes.
mentioned this being a radical move.
Radical, well, radical in the context that California scope and scale will radically change the debate on drug policy in the United States of America. To the extent that is significant, yes, a radical departure from the status quo in terms of a national discourse on a profoundly important issue where millions of people's lives are impacted every single year. People behind bars, incapable of getting jobs because they're signing off on those felonies. Black and brown folks disproportionately being impacted. Yeah, it's a radical departure.
So radical departure, national discourse. How does this
International, yeah.
How does this compare to the radical push for marriage equality.
Oh gosh, yeah.
And in terms of social benefit and in terms of being radical.
Different. I mean, to me, that was a foundational issue of civil rights. This is social justice. This is racial justice. This is economic justice. That's
Okay, civil rights, social justice.
Well,
I mean,
I think you can have the same. You use them in the same language, but I think they are different. This is a drug. It's a drug. This is a drug that impairs people. It has medical benefits. I think that's absolute and objective. But it's not healthy for kids to use and abuse this drug. That's why we're not changing the rules. In fact,
So
in many
less-
respects, we're strengthening them because we're going to target that concern in ways we haven't targeted in the past. So I do separate it from a civil rights issue, a foundational issue of equality, and then the question of a social justice issue, a racial and economic justice
so
issue.
secondary in your personal
Not
portfolio.
secondary. It's to me an extension of the narrative of the why. For me, if you ask me the why I exist, it's kind of to stand up for ideals and strike out against injustice. This is certainly part of that, striking out against injustice. African Americans are arrested 3.73 times more than Caucasians. We use the drug just as much as others. I mean, these are objective facts and truths. Those to me are profoundly significant issues, and they aren't for those that haven't been impacted. And I get it, but boy, communities that are impacted. And I believe our criminal justice system. I believe that Grover Norquist is right. I believe that Rick Perry's right. I believe that Newt Gingrich is right. That our criminal justice system needs to radically be reformed, and drug policy reform is a big part of that. And I suggest those three to suggest there's a broad coalition here. It's not just social justice proponents from the far left. I think it's an interesting coalition of folks on the other side of the aisle that are beginning to reconcile this.
I'm interested in your perspective as a winery owner.
Yeah, that back to the fact that I am involved in a drug that I sell that impairs people. And it goes to the why I in particular feel some sense of accountability to my point of view, that I can't square that circle. That I sit there at my restaurant and someone does say, hey, give me a bottle of Jack Daniels. And somehow that's okay. And the poor bloke's there and, may have a few drinks, and that, by the way, is exponentially, at least scientifically, based on every objective analysis, more dangerous than marijuana, the addictive qualities of alcohol, et cetera, the social costs. I can't square that and say somehow someone goes and has a little bit of a brownie at home with his wife instead of an Ambien, which has all kinds of side effects because they have a hard time sleeping. Somehow that person should be incarcerated. Those are the issues, that for me made this just an obvious accountability. I mean, if I wasn't in the wine business, a restaurant, hotel wine business, and with all these liquor licenses, maybe I can walk around this issue and act holier than now. But boy, I'd be a walking hypocrite as someone who's involved in the alcohol industry and suggest somehow this is morally superior in terms of one should be legal, one should not.
Do you see this as having an impact on the wine industry? There are some publicly traded beverage companies that have put out warnings to their investors that this is a risk factor, that people will drink less alcohol if pot is
Probably
not only
a good
easier to
thing.
get but also more culturally acceptable to use. And
I think that's true. I think you're seeing, back to early, if they use their stats, let's use ours. I mean, I think both of us should temper our statistical evidence coming from these other states, but you're seeing just some modest evidence to prove that point, to make your point, that low-end alcohol sales will be impacted potentially. I think the pharmaceutical industry is much more to lose than any industry. I mean, you want a drug problem. That's the number one drug problem in the United States of America. Opiates. Yeah. It's devastating. By the way, there'll have never been an initiative more impactful at addressing that than Prop 64. Because there'll never have been an initiative that set aside more money to deal with the legitimate drug addiction and drug problems in the state, dedicated to counties than Prop 64 because of the opportunity now to get state funds for drug and alcohol addiction. I hope so. I mean, it's not anecdotal. You hear folks all the time that are using. It's an interesting. There's some. The New York Times did a really interesting piece on, and this was about 6 months ago. It's worth taking a look at. They analyzed states that have the most liberal medical marijuana laws, and then they layered over the number of opioid-related overdoses, and they're substantially lower
Yeah, so
than other states, which suggests perhaps the substitution factor that you're referencing. And I think that's a pretty healthy thing. But, you know, and so I think there will be, my sense is there will be an increase in use, absolutely. But I think it's 50, 60, 70, 80-year-olds. I don't know if that's so devastating. And there's a, you know, for kids it's a separate thing. Absolutely. I'm going to be the most vehement in fact, even for our coalition, they get uncomfortable because I always begin, I'm anti-marijuana, but I'm anti-prohibition, I'm pro-legalization. And people are, what? You know, confused by that, but you shouldn't be. Again, I just think the idea that the law is against it, and the bigger harm is the harm of prohibition than even the drug, if we can medicalize the abuse. But there will be, I think, some commensurate increase and I think commensurate decrease as people substitute.
What about for this wine industry?
I don't see it. This is a high-end premium industry. I mean, we are in the heart of, this is the premium market. So I don't think it impacting anyone here. This is the night train world. I'm not suggesting night train, but because that's.
But you just did on Facebook.
No, but I quickly amended it. So there's a tape that couldn't be edited.
There goes the night train.
No, but not to. But yeah, and I'm not. By the way, I don't think it will be night train. But I mean, I think you're right. I mean, someone who may have a glass or two of wine may have one glass. And may have a small little. I mean, you go to these medical clubs. I mean, this is again more and more people. This is not. It's not the day of people just smoking this. There's not sort of the bongs and everything. There's sort of the TV of it. The way we think about these things. It's there's pills now being prescribed. I mean, it's a very sophisticated market. It's a much more mature market, and people are dosing more appropriately. And it's for a wellness perspective. There's a very real world out there for folks that I don't think is so devastating unhealthy. There's relationships that are being improved because someone's taking the edge off with something that's a little healthier for them without the side effect.
We haven't mentioned it, but I should mention it. It bans public consumption, so there's no public consumption allowed. And anywhere that there's smoking laws, you can't consume marijuana. So we just increased the smoking law to 21, and we set a new set of standards around vaping. Same things will apply to marijuana. But of course, marijuana, not only the medical benefits, so that's unique from tobacco, but increasingly people aren't consuming medical or marijuana through smoking. They're all consuming it through other means. But the rules will
Multifamily
still apply.
housing or attached housing, that's become an issue at tobacco
Apartments.
and with-
That was another tough one because again we viewed this as a right. And we wanted to criminalize, but we wanted to preserve land use, local land use rights to the greatest extent possible, as well as landlord rights. So, in rental housing, landlords are going to be able to set the rules. That's not going to change under Prop 64.
Gavin, can I just add, I think I've heard you say twice that you're anti-marijuana.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
I just don't like it. I don't like the smell. I don't like. I back to being a parent. I don't want my kids smoking marijuana. There's serious brain issues as it relates to their development. I don't want to see it celebrated. I'm not here to condone its use or abuse. I cannot stand the smell. I sure as heck don't want to walk to a park and smell it. I don't like seeing people out there in streets and side corners. When I was going to high school, frankly, a lot of folks in the back parking lot smoking, I think could have done more in their lives.
Yeah.
So I'm not pro-marijuana. I'm just vehemently anti-prohibition.
And more choice.
When was the last time that you ingested marijuana?
Never.
Never?
Never. You'll never. So you won't. There's no 2005 Billy Bush video of me. Sorry.
Did you inhale?
No, I don't even have to worry about that. It's just never my thing. And it was ironic because when I was in high school, I remember almost without exception, everyone I knew smoked it. And I was more interested in turning. Candidly, if it was like, can someone get a beer? And then it was like, that's impossible. I'm like, wait a second, how's it? That's legal.
Where was this? Bellarmine?
Redwood High School. It was just, they're like, you can't get alcohol, but boy, everyone can get marijuana. It sort of makes the point, right? Who are we fooling
It's
here?
true today. Yeah.
Right, it's true today. So, that's the whole point about if we're protecting our kids, boy, we're failing. One's legal, one's not. It seems that we've got this backwards a little bit in terms of the accessibility. So,
You mentioned a disagreement in your home. What is that?
my wife, she's back. I think she shares. She's in that sort of I've got kids. I don't want to see. It goes back to the things you guys started with, and the things that I started with 2 years ago when I said, I don't want to see this quote unquote normalized. And then until I said, I started to realize deeper. It already is. I mean, it's like, what world am I living in to suggest it's not?
And she remains less convinced.
She's closer, and I have this dream that she'll be the one person in our last ad that's saying, I was on the fence,
finally.
and now I've come around. And she's my dream final ad.
Okay.
And if that
Focus
happens,
group of
then it
one.
came through. So I focus group. She when I gave her the study out of Colorado teachers, she said, that's just nonsense. That's ridiculous. That's just not true. I know for a fact. In fact, she even said, my father said something the other day, said just the opposite. I said, well, then, hold on. And then we looked at the study, it's nonsense. And then I said, well, that's interesting. I mean, she honestly was like, well, now you're starting to convince me that it wasn't some giant spike because everyone said, hey, I can go get it. And I reminded her it's still illegal. She goes, and you lose that, right? You think, okay, it's legal. So it's legal, but it's not legal if you're 21 and younger. It's still illegal. But the difference is we'll have resources to target those kids. We're not going to,
We're not going to give them a criminal record.
And we actually have in there. We didn't even get into all the language as it relates to expunging records for people with previous felonies that have the chance to go back and remove those, which is an economic development issue. We didn't even talk about the $50 million a year set aside for job training programs and economic development opportunities for those communities been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. There's a lot of social justice focus in here. That's why the ACLU is part of this process. DPA, which is the Soros-related group that was part of the Colorado, Washington, Oregon, Alaska moves and big principal supporters of medical. So there's the social justice is played an outsized role in all of these things, and those things I think those things compete with the concerns around normalization, and that's our challenge is to make that argument publicly. And that's not easy.
Maybe we can wrap this up.
Yeah.
We have
You've
one other
been
question.
generous
But
your time.
Before we leave, as you think about your next job, which might not have the word lieutenant in front of it,
Right. Well, certainly not after this.
knowing that this proposition.
How did this happen? You know me, Steve. How did this happen to me? I'm sitting here talking about this issue.
Knowing that 64 will be, tied to Gavin Newsom. Does anything about this and its implementation keep you up at night?
Yeah, a ton. Absolutely. And that's why I have to be accountable. More than any other human being. I will feel, even though that may not be, it's certainly not the case. There are so many extraordinary people that put us in this position, for better or for worse, depending on your perspective. But I will have played an outsized role personally in terms of my own accountability to the things I'm asserting in this process. And so as a consequence of monitoring this and making sure we do what we say we're going to do, boy, I'm going to be very aggressive front and center in that. Even if I'm not in elected office, I'm going to be accountable to making sure this is done right. And I feel I have a unique voice in that debate and some some credibility with the advocates out there to make a case that we have to be mature about this and not ideological. But this is, look, 10 years from now, this is going to be a very different conversation we're having. And there are things that we never even brought up in this meeting that we'll look back and say, boy, how did we miss that? That went much better than we ever thought, or are outsized concerns and consideration that may and I think a lot of them will be in the Emerald Triangle. I mean, that no world's going to be more impacted. I mean, I get the trepidation up there. You feel it when you're up there. Yeah. And as he says, we're getting more and more people on board, but some people are just holding off. Some it's. This is I don't want to use again the word radical because it's not a good word to use, but it scares people. But it's certainly a radical departure for some that have been operating a certain mindset.
I don't think anybody is satisfied with the status quo, so it certainly is challenging that.
Yeah.
We've underscored it 15 times, but it's important on this question, which is majority vote change by the legislature going forward on everything but for most things but the tax. That's unusual for a ballot measure, but we want to be able to make changes as we go, and maximum flexibility for regulators.
And
this
that's
is
why-
going to evolve
Unlike
as we
Prop
go.
That would
250,
include a tied house style decision on licensing?
Yeah,
Yeah,
in
boy.
fact, there's going to be an ongoing, that's going to be an interesting
Huge issue.
regulatory discussion about
Huge.
how the two systems we designed this, we didn't want to make that decision for the regulators. So we allowed the regulators to kind of figure out how they want to reconcile the two systems. But
Do you,
Yeah, and by the way, I want to say, in 10 years, I hope we'll have addressed whatever issue has been the outside issue. I mean, that's the point, flexibility. No one's trying to put their head in the sand and deny the changing reality.
well, we'll hope to have you back here before 10 years.
I don't know that I will.
We're going to have night training for you.
famous night train.
Listen, do you have a few minutes just to talk about Prop 63
Yeah, of
first?
course.
Just to get your thoughts on your.
Yeah, gun issue. Gun safety.
Yeah, what was your what I mean, we'll be honest. We have Mike Thompson, our congressman up here, is not a big fan of it.
Yeah, we're conflicted on
Yeah.
what to do with this, just
Yeah.
based on our ongoing support of what Mike's trying to do.